truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, folks. Another great episode for you. This time with a very smart and accomplished individual, Andy McCarthy. Andy McCarthy is a senior fellow at National Review, also author of Ball of Confusion: The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy is really well known for his very good and thoughtful takes on all things legal and and all things political as well. Again, a prolific writer for National Review. You should really listen to him, listen to his podcast. He was a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York as well. Andy, thanks for being on.
Dan, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's get into a piece you wrote today about what we're doing in Texas and Governor Abbott's vaccine mandate. Conservatives widely hail this as a good thing. And not without good reason. Look, it's a response to the overreach by the federal government. I think that seems obvious, but of course there's more nuance to it than that. And I think you get into it. So let's dive into that. What's your take on it?
Yeah, well, I think it's a more interesting question whether you can do a mandate against a private employer than what I wrote about, which was kind of a nudgy, pain in the butt legal point, which is when you get down to the end of Governor Abbott's order, I don't think he actually orders what they're saying he ordered. So the way his office, as I understand it, put it out is that he's directed that private employers can't mandate employees to get vaccinated as a condition of keeping their jobs. But even though he's got that kind of in the windup, all these whereas clauses, as the lawyers call them, when he gets down to the end and he talks about what he's enforcing and what the actual prohibition is, what he basically says is no one can force anyone to get vaccinated. And just to be a nudge, it's a different thing to say I can't make you get vaccinated than to say you don't have to get vaccinated, but if you want to work here, you have to be vaccinated. So I think that order is going to have a hard time in the courts just because of the way he's articulated it, because I think in the end, what he says is not really all that remarkable. It's just that nobody can force anyone else to get vaccinated, which is not exactly, breaking news.
Right. Okay. And so you're saying that that's not even really what's happening, because what's actually happening is employers are giving their employees a choice. They could argue that they're not forcing anybody to do anything. They're just saying, we'll destroy your life if you don't take this. Right. So I mean, so it gets to a kind of a broader philosophical point, because libertarians might look at this problem and say, look, we're fighting bad policy with more bad policy. And this is a constant debate on the conservative side. Do we use their tactics to get what we know, to get done what we know is right? Now, in this case, and I think every situation is different with respect to that question. I mean, it's pretty obvious that this is a state reaction to a federal overreach. And I think we would all applaud that. The question is, how do you do it? And can government tell private businesses what to do with their employees? That gets into a much more interesting question about anti-discrimination law. I mean, are these things, should we change our entire paradigm about how we think about these things?
Yeah, well, that's my question is just as a, I'm not a paleocon or a neocon or a populist. I'm a Bill Buckley type conservative, right? And from where I sit, I don't know why my economic liberty in terms of who I decide to hire. I mean, there's some things the federal government obviously over history and because of court decisions can intrude on. So if you want to discriminate racially in hiring, for example, that's verboten. You can't do. But with other than those unusual exceptions, I'm supposed to have economic liberty. I'm supposed to be able to hire who I want and to impose on it what conditions I want. And I don't understand why my economic liberty has to take a back seat to your personal liberty not to get vaccinated. I mean, if you don't want to get vaccinated, that's fine by me. Go work someplace else. And that's my sort of reaction to it. Now, when the government does things, it's different because the government has to answer to constitutional restrictions that the private employer doesn't. But I'd be very uncomfortable. I am very uncomfortable with the idea that the government can tell private employers that they must hire somebody or they must allow somebody to retain his job if the employer wants to have everybody vaccinated. Personally, I don't know how I'd feel about it, but I do think that they have a right to do that.
Yeah, and look, Texas is a fire at will kind of state, so they don't need to say that the cause is for vaccinations. They can just fire you for any reason. And so it begs the question, will this be enforceable at all? And again, did two wrongs make a right in this case? Because the first wrong was very clearly by the Biden administration. Because if you can't tell employers what to do with their employees, well, you also certainly can't tell them they'll be fined if they don't do what you want them to do with their employees. And again, I kind of bring it back to a more philosophical question of how we should look at this. Because look, when you're hiring somebody, you could lay out a whole set of terms very transparently. And if you don't abide by that, if you don't dress this way, if you don't act this way, you're fired. You can make that as specific as you want. There should be no intervention in that. But you look at a situation like this and, imagine a scenario where, okay, you've been with Southwest for 30 years and you don't have a network anymore. This is all you have. If you get fired from this is a big deal. And if an employer loses their minds and starts doing weird stuff and says, I want you to wear lipstick every day to work. I want you to do this. If you don't like it, you can leave. I mean, that's the kind of the libertarian approach. But if as a conservative, I do believe that the purpose of government is to prevent the infringement of rights upon our citizens, not just from government, but from other citizens. That's why murder is illegal, And so the question that we're always asking legislatively then is what constitutes that infringement? Like, at what point does it require government intervention? And that's a constantly debatable point. As long as we start from that basic principle. And so, and that's why I think this particular question on the mandates is interesting.
Yeah, well, I think also the point that you make about, when do two wrongs make a right, or do two wrongs ever make a right? As you were saying that, I was wondering all the different things that we deal with. Where are we ever on, like, what they call tabula rasa? Where are we ever on the place where nobody's made a move yet? It seems like every single situation that we're in, it has been screwed up somewhere along the line, usually on both sides. And we're always in a situation where wrongs have been done on both sides. So it's kind of past the point a lot of times of saying two wrongs don't make a right, because you're already in the middle of a situation like that. But to my mind, I think there's a big difference between prospective stuff and imposing on employers things that are not in existence when they take the action. And what I mean by that is, we have certain things as a government that we impose on employers, and the federal government can do a lot less of it than the state government does. But we have, wage and hour laws, minimum wage laws, child labor laws, discrimination laws. So we do have a whole array of restrictions that we impose on employers. And I think if I'm an employer, I say, okay, well, that's the field of play that I'm on, which means everything that they haven't already restricted, I can do. Even if it's something stupid, like you said, like, you have to wear lipstick to work today. Idiotic condition. And maybe if it got out, the way our society is supposed to work, if I adopt an idiotic condition and I impose it on everyone, that's going to hurt my pocketbook. That's why I don't do it. If it gets around that I'm a lunatic, that's going to hurt my customer base. We rely on that, I think, more than we rely on legal restrictions, or at least we should. But I think if you want to make a rule that says, going forward, employers now have to do X, we can argue where it is on the continuum of is this too much of a restriction on economic liberty, or is it something, given everything else that we've regulated, that's along the lines of things that we're allowed to regulate? But I don't think it's fair to just sort of make up rules in the middle of the game on employers. And I think if you're going to do it like Abbott did it, you have to do it clearly, because doing it by executive order is its own bag of problems to begin with.
And I don't think he would have done it, to be fair, if the federal government hadn't have started it. I think if various businesses in Texas were, some required vaccines, some didn't, I don't think he would get involved. But I feel like states have to, because of what the federal government has done. It gets to another interesting case, a little older, but the famous transgender case that was decided in the Supreme Court in a way that I certainly did not like. But the situation was basically this: a guy named Bob, and that's not his real name, but I don't remember his name. A guy named Bob works at a funeral home for years and years and years and years, and then one day he comes in and his name is not Bob anymore. His name is Sally. And he's now dresses like a woman. He's fully transitioned, so it's now a woman. Employer fires him or her, and because your behavior has changed radically. And so I think that, to me, that's really the distinction, in how anti-discrimination law might play into this. I don't like a lot of the anti-discrimination law. Seems like now it's turned into what was a very necessary thing in the civil rights era, to now just a list of things that we can sue each other for. I qualify for, disabled and veteran and all these things. And I think that's unnecessary. But I think it's more interesting to look at it as once your behavior shifts radically, and that's why I think they didn't decide that case correctly, because this isn't necessarily an immutable characteristic. This is a very clear and present behavioral change that affects your place of employment. So what do you think about that?
Well, my objection to that case is the fraudulent nature of the judicial decision, in the sense that if you guys wanted to change the civil rights laws and you wanted to debate it and alter a statute that was written in the 1960s and put in those kinds of protections along the rationale that, look, this is the next step in the continuum of expanding our sense of what liberty is and what it demands. I might disagree with that, but it would be the proper way to do it. The problem with what the court did in that case is it took the language that was written in the statute decades ago, and it said that Congress, in using that language, meant to address gender identity, which is a concept that didn't even exist at the time that the statute was written. So, and it was even more strange to those of us who follow the stuff closely, because Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the decision, is an originalist, and a textualist.
He disappointed a lot of people on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a walk on the wild side, but a textualist. The whole idea of being a textualist, which is the statutory version of what an originalist is for constitutional purposes, the whole idea is you are stuck with the public understanding of what the provision meant at the time it was adopted. And that doesn't mean that you can't change it, but that means that the court can't change it, that Congress has to change it. So I think the big problem with that case is, and there's a lot of this in the court's jurisprudence along the 14th Amendment and this whole area of liberty. The way our system works, those decisions, which are very tough decisions to make, are supposed to be made by the people's representatives. Mm-hmm. And the most important aspect of that is, if you guys get it wrong, you can come back and change it. You could get 3 years later, 4 years later, you say, well, this isn't what we really were trying to do. And you can tweak it. Now, we can all talk about like how difficult it is to change legislation. I get that, but at least it's possible. Whereas the way this system works, if the Supreme Court gets something wrong, and they do it under the auspices of what they say is a constitutional decision. So they're now telling you this is what the 14th Amendment means. Congress can't change that. The only way you can change that is to amend the Constitution, which is virtually very, very difficult to do and has only been done a relative handful of times. Or the Supreme Court, the 9 unelected lawyers have to decide, well, we screwed up that one. Let's change that. And systemically, that's just the wrong way to go about it. Yeah,
it's extremely frustrating, and it has real consequences. And I think freedom of association is a pretty important principle for a free society. So is the First Amendment. So I actually want to bring it to another subject as we kind of blow through these issues. Facebook whistleblower. You wrote a good piece on this, and I agree with it fully. Basically, how the right has been tricked on this issue. Now, I'm not sure we've been tricked into supporting bad legislation or bad policy. I haven't seen evidence of that necessarily, but we've certainly been tricked into giving the Democrats exactly what they want on messaging. And the temptation to yell at the big tech social media CEOs is just so powerful for our big performers up in Congress. They just can't help themselves. And the Democrats have laid a trap for them that it infuriates me. But I'll let you take it from there. You wrote a good piece about this.
Well, look, I think that social media, by and large, is very good for us. It's very good for conservatives. There's a lot of, look, they're run by mainly progressives. And they have a point of view, but for the most part, it's an open forum. We get to put out our message, and for those who say that you can't, how does someone like Donald Trump ever get elected? With all this, and I'm like, Donald Trump got elected in 2016. I mean, what are you talking about? Social media was the alternative to the big networks, right?
Right. So.
I think there are always going to be a handful of things that you can complain about. And it's certainly a very, these businesses are imperfect, just like every other businesses. But I just think it's really ridiculous to portray Facebook as if what it's about is making teenage girls cry, and that's what we're now going to focus on. And that's why I tried to, in the piece I wrote, I compared the New York City subway system, which I rode for many years beginning as a kid. And you could say a lot of terrible things about the New York subway system, and they'd all be true. I mean, crime-ridden, disease-ridden, every other bad-ridden that you can imagine. Also, if they didn't exist, I wouldn't have been able to go to high school. I wouldn't have been able to go to college. I wouldn't have worked. And a whole universe that was open to me wouldn't have been open to me. So I just think that what we tend to do in these debates, especially in this era of populism, is to kind of caricature what it is we're talking about and then act like the caricature is the thing that we need to regulate. And everybody gets so caught up in the caricature, what they miss is, if you think that having a government bureaucracy come in and regulate social media, which they couldn't do unless you get over the hurdle of saying that it's okay if they regulate our speech, and you think that's going to be a better world for conservatives, you're smoking something.
Right. And what did she say? What was her name again? It was
Haugen.
Yeah. What she said was so interesting. She wasn't advocating for some kind of legislation or tweaks to Section 230, which is the Republican platform on this. She was advocating for an oversight committee where, and I'm quoting her, where someone like me could go. Like, she was talking about literally creating a bureaucracy that she would be in charge of because she's mad at her old employer or whatever, and she wants to be in charge of them, and then make them do the nice things, because this is what the left is all about. It's always about, we're just really good people, and we need to get rid of all these silly obstacles that allow us to just do all these nice things for you. You know, and that's
Right.
it's a common feature. And
Right.
you said something interesting too, which is whether it's the subway analogy or whether it's, you know, the movies and glossy magazines before social media existed, and America for that matter. This notion that the left loves to do and that the right shouldn't fall for, which is to take the warts on someone and judge them based on that sin or that problem.
Right.
And they do this with the country, right? I mean, they would look at the sins of our country and they say, well, down with it all. You know, our founding is based on white supremacy. Look at the 1619 Project. They do it in those big issues like that, and they do it in these smaller issues. And we're conservatives. We're supposed to be the ones that sort of filter that out and say, look, well, hold on a second. Like, the first question I always ask as a conservative is the thing you're saying is a problem actually a big problem? And like on the teenage angst thing, I'm like, I'm actually not convinced that it is, based on some of the good argumentation that I've seen. And you know, it's a problem, but it's always been a problem. Does social media make it worse? I would say probably. I mean, it must, right? Because we're just communicating more. You know?
Well, that's the whole. I mean, you know, look, if you're going to have a social media platform, which means human beings communicating with each other, it's gonna reflect all of the dysfunction and all of the cultural problems we have, because it's just our communications are a reflection of who we are. So, you know, I just think, you know, Bill Buckley, one time, I can't remember which book he wrote that I saw this in, but it was a great line along the lines of, you know, if you find, I think he's talking about political parties. And he said, if you find the perfect political party, good for you, join it. But understand that the minute you join it, human being, it's that much less perfect than it was before you got involved. And I just think it's good wisdom. You mentioned the history of the country, and that's absolutely right. But every one of us should understand that we all have our own, you know, we're all sinners. We all have our own baggage. We all have our own imperfections. And a lot of the demagoguery that goes on is like trying to put that in a cabin someplace. Like, we don't, you know, we're the first perfect people in the history of the world. And we have a right to sit here and judge, you know, forget about the fact that the framers put together the greatest government in the history of the world, of the history of humanity. And now let's talk about like the, you know, the awful things in their closets, as if we didn't have them. And I just think it's not only a short-sighted way to look at things, it's a poisonous way to look at things, and it's a very unrealistic way to look at people and the social constructs that people actually create.
Yeah, and I just wish Republicans had more intuition on who Zuckerberg and Dorsey, who they really are, because my assessment of them is a little different than most of my colleagues, and I think I'm right. Okay, like I've been on social. I mean, as it comes as no surprise, I think I'm right. But you know, but I've been on social media longer than anybody in Congress by far, because I was just in college when it appeared, and I happened to be in college like right next door to Harvard. So I didn't go to Harvard, but it was near there. So I had social media for a very long time. I understand it pretty well and how it's evolved.
I was also once near Harvard, so we have that.
Yeah, been there. So, you know, I think these guys are true liberals, just instinctively. I think they're liberal. I don't think they're authoritarian leftists. And if we could just recognize that and then adopt the right messaging accordingly, we would be in a better place. It wouldn't make these kind of mistakes, in my estimation.
I wonder what you think of this. I heard, I hadn't heard this before, but Senator Mike Lee was interviewed by David Bahnsen on Capitol Matters at National Review, which has been, these conversations are terrific week by week. But he made a point that I hadn't really thought of, but it did kind of hit home what the real problem is that people have with social media. And Bill Barr used to talk about this as Attorney General too. And it's that these guys at the beginning said, we're going to be an open forum. We're not going to use any kind of, we're not going to do content editing. We're not going to do ideological purging. And then once they got a dominant market position, then they started to dabble in editing. So what he said, and I think I want to think about this some more, but what he said basically is that's not a social media internet exchange platform problem. That's a business fraud problem. And if you want to make a cause of action that says, these guys made certain representations and then they didn't live up to them, you could sort of add that on to the antitrust laws without having to screw up the fundamentals of the system and overregulate people's communications, which I think we should not want to do.
Right, I fully agree. And to be fair to even the Republicans who I think have messaged this wrong, everybody centers on it is mostly starting to center around, I think, the right policy. Tweaks to Section 230. I mean, I have a bill that would just add a condition in there that says this does not apply if you are discriminating against political ideology. Now, how do you enforce that? We got to think through that. Maybe I'm curious of what your take on that is, and how would they get around it? But at least it would be a message that I think they would understand very clearly. I don't know what breaking up these companies will ever do. Maybe it would help. Maybe it wouldn't. It kind of just seems like it's sort of a populist cry to just because we're mad at them. Okay, maybe. I don't know. I don't know what that would end up doing. But you're exactly right. It is more like business fraud. Consumer protection law is another avenue that we're looking at as far as better ways to enforce this. Because what conservatives don't have a problem with censorship. They just have a problem with that the censorship isn't applied neutrally. These platforms have to censor things. I mean, even Parler censors a bunch of stuff and moderates a lot of content. Otherwise, the experience would be very weird and people would be putting crazy things up all the time. But conservatives just have a problem because we feel as if that censorship is biased against us for political reasons. And I think we have a pretty good case about that.
Yeah, I think it is. My attitude about 230 has been that I think what people miss about it is that it's not a regulatory regime. It's a government benefit. So to my mind, it's kind of like a tax-exempt company in the sense that what the tax code says is if you want the exemption, you have to comply with certain conditions. So that, for example, if you want the tax exemption, you can't participate in political campaigns. We're not telling you can't participate in political campaigns. You want to participate in political campaigns, knock yourself out, but you don't get the exemption. So that would be it. And to me, with 230, what I would say about that is it's a government immunity from lawsuits. And if you want to qualify for the government immunity from lawsuits, then the government ought to be able to lay out with some exactitude what the conditions are that you have to comply with, because no one's making you comply with it. If they want to be a left-wing website, I write for a right-wing website. I don't have anything against left-wing websites, but I think if they want to say that we're an internet service provider and a medium of exchange and we're not doing editing, then they ought to be able to apply the First Amendment like the government applies the First Amendment, which means, there's certain traditional time-honored exemptions from the First Amendment, fighting words, obscenity, there's, time, place, and manner restrictions. These are all traditional exemptions from First Amendment coverage. But I think if you're going to act like an editor of a political magazine, then you got to be treated like an editor of a political magazine, and you don't get the immunity from suit. And part of I think the gulf here is that what the government allows them to do, the government basically says, we're going to exempt you if you pull stuff down that looks like, for example, it's aiding and abetting crimes or terrorism or what have you. And they have all these traditional exemptions from free expression, which is fine. And then they have this black box at the end, which is, and whatever terms of service you impose. And if you're going to do that, the game is over. Then they're able to design whatever it is that they want to design that allows them to edit or purge whatever they want to purge. And I think that needs to get tightened up. And there's no equitable problem tightening that up, because you're not forcing them to do anything. You're saying, if you want this government protection of immunity from suit, you have to do the things that we lay out to qualify for it. And if you want to be a left-wing website, good luck. Be a left-wing website.
So wish you more time, but we don't. For the audience's situational awareness, this is actually the day that I flew back to D.C. to go vote on the debt ceiling thing, and I'm flying back out again tonight. But maybe we can answer this one quickly. You've written about this as well. Merrick Garland in the Department of Justice has written this threatening letter, threatening parents and offering help to all these local authorities because of these domestic terrorists that are infiltrating their school board meetings and all of that nonsense. And examples of this domestic terrorism, they're rampant. I mean, people are sending mean letters. They're calling them Marxists. I mean, God, if I've ever, that's domestic terrorism. If I've ever seen it, now obviously people can just hear the sarcasm exuding from me. But here's my simple question here. Do people have anything to worry about? Does that letter from Merrick Garland hold any weight? Does the federal government have any ability to intimidate these parents from doing this?
Well, bottom line sense, no. They don't have any way of enforcing incitement regulations against them or violating the First Amendment, but they have raw power. So, your First Amendment guarantees just a parchment promise. If they can tell you have free speech, but if they also tell you, the way you behaved at that meeting, we're going to have the FBI look into that. If they decide to abuse their raw power to conduct investigations, either you guys have to stop them or pretty much nobody's going to stop them. Now, it's possible that you could file civil rights suits against them, which is hard for parents to do. But the problem here is the abuse of the investigative power. If you're asking me as a bottom line, is there ever going to be a federal prosecution for any of this stuff? No, there's no authority under the incitement statute. There's no authority under the First Amendment. But that doesn't stop them from saying, we're going to have the FBI look into what you're doing and putting you in the anxiety of being under investigation, and maybe even having to go into your pocket and hire a lawyer and all. So I just think that's the problem. It's the abuse of the investigative power.
It's like you brought up this example too in your piece about the IRS and what they did under the Obama administration. So is this just the new tactic of the left to threaten these kind of investigations? I mean, they do it to oil companies, they do it to gun companies, they do it to conservative activist groups who are seeking nonprofit status, and this is just another tactic.
It's
I guess
the process.
How do we fight back? I mean, is there good legislation or changes that we could make that would disincentivize this kind of behavior from the federal government?
Yeah, you got to start cutting their budget. I mean, the framers' idea was that if powers got abused, the biggest check on executive excess was going to be that Congress would cut their budget and make it impossible for them to do the lawless things they want to do. Now, we don't do budgeting, I think, the way that
no
that the framers had in mind. But I think if you start, like, for example, I've never understood, Dan, why we give the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department the budget that we give it. Understand, when the Justice Department goes around, like, they want to regulate every police department in the country, right? There's no federal authority to regulate the police departments. But what do? They send the Civil Rights Division out to conduct investigations. And the fact of the matter is the Justice Department has a $30 billion budget. There's not a city in America, including New York, that can litigate with it. So what they all end up doing is saying uncle. And usually this is Democrats on both ends of the table when this comes up. So they're not really very difficult negotiations. And they strike these consent decrees. And the consent decree becomes the law that reforms the police department. And
see.
it all happens because the Justice Department has an enormous budget and nobody's stopping them from doing this stuff.
That's interesting. Any other idea? Is there any other idea besides cutting the budget? I mean, look, you can probably get every Republican to nod their head in agreement with that, but just the way our budgeting process works, and also how much, it's $30 billion. Could they still do as much damage with $15 billion? And the answer is probably yes. Do we just need more legal avenues to take, to take kind of vengeful action back against the federal government when they go along a path to such an extent, knowing full well, or even not knowing full well, but they never find anything at the end? I mean, this gets into a question, for say false accusations, from citizen to citizen. Should there be more punishment for false accusations to disincentivize some of the behavior that we've seen? Are these people, entities, protected properly, legally?
Yeah, well, Judge Silberman in the D.C. Circuit and Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court have both written interesting opinions about how New York Times versus Sullivan, which controls libel in connection at least with public figures, that it way shifted things in favor of the media and against the person who gets defamed.
Yeah.
And what they point out is that there's nothing in the Constitution or the prior jurisprudence of the Supreme Court that would justify New York Times versus Sullivan. It just basically, it was that crazy era of the 1970s where the court had absolutely no compunction about legislating from the bench, and they did it. And both of these judges, who are very smart guys, say that, we ought to take a long look at that. And I think we should. I think the balance is wrong.
And that's for public figures. And I'm well aware of how difficult it is for me to take any action against anybody in the media if they slander me. Just because you're a public figure, so they can say anything they want about you. I'm not sure why, but it is the case. But at least I'm a public figure. Like, at least I can correct the record publicly as a public figure. But private citizens, granted they have more standing against, say, the New York Times goes after them. Famously, Nick Sandmann won a huge amount of money. We're not sure how much, against CNN. But it's these sort of not just frivolous lawsuits, but frivolous investigations. It seems like there's some space there for either judicial reform or legislative reform. Just not exactly sure what it is.
I think if just one other thing on that, I would say it's not just, don't just slash their budget. You have to put explicit riders in that basically say not one dime for X, Y, or Z thing. I mean, if you decided they've overdone it on reforming police departments, not one dime for affirmative civil litigation against police departments in the United States for the next 12 months. So you can stop. You guys have the power to stop them. I mean, you know much better than I do the dysfunction that you're dealing with. But the way the system is set up, you can stop them.
Well, shifting topics. Once again, I think we have a little bit more time than I thought. Can we talk about something people are pretty interested in still? The Durham report. It's kind of pokes its head out every once in a while, and somebody gets indicted. What are your thoughts on where it might be going, and is it going to uncover what we think it's going to uncover? And is anybody going to get punished?
Probably not in the way of a slew of indictments, but I think probably the most meaningful thing that happened in the last couple of years in connection with that investigation is that as he was leaving, Attorney General Barr made Durham a special counsel rather than just like a U.S. attorney from Connecticut who he happened to be assigning to look at this. And as a special counsel under the regs, he gets to write a report just like Mueller did. It would ultimately be up to Attorney General Garland how much of the public got to see that. But it looks to me like he's ultimately aiming toward a big report. And the indictment that he filed about a month ago against Michael Sussman, who is an attorney, well-known Democratic firm, and he's been an attorney for the Democratic National Committee. He's a cyber security guy at the Justice Department in his public career. But that indictment is really interesting. It's, if you just look at it as a charge, there's a narrow charge at the end that just says basically he misrepresented to the FBI who he was representing when he came to give them information that he wanted investigated about whether there was a tie between Trump and this Alpha Bank, which is an important bank in Russia. So, basically the story is he pretended, according to them, to be just a concerned citizen. And in fact, he was working for the Clinton campaign and for this other guy, tech executive, who was hoping to get a job in the Clinton campaign. That's the narrow charge. What's very interesting about the case is the 27 pages that come before the charge, which kind of lay out a narrative. You could almost see Durham saying, okay, well, they keep asking where I'm going. Here's where I'm going. And if you read that narrative, it looks to me like his theory is that the Trump-Russia collusion narrative was basically a concoction by the Clinton campaign that they peddled to the media and to the FBI through their lawyers and through outfits like GPS or Fusion GPS, right? And they get the FBI to open investigations against Trump. And then they put out publicly that Trump is under investigation on the basis of the information that so it's all circular. But it looks like where Durham is going is that's his theory of what happened. And if it is, it's always possible that he could come up with some charges. Like if that they're going to take false information and bring it to the FISA court, maybe there's a theory there for obstruction of justice or something like that. But I think for the most part, this is political dirty tricks and abuse of power, which aren't always violations of the penal code, but are really serious stuff. And that's usually what you'll end up finding in a special counsel's final report, as opposed to a bunch of big indictments.
Yeah, I think we're all looking forward to that. Well, again, changing subjects, because one thing I wanted to ask you, because you noted this when we were talking about Facebook, is how the populist right increasingly looks like the sort of authoritarian left by kind of adopting their tactics. And how dangerous do you think that is for our movement? Has it always been there? And how do you define populism necessarily?
Well, I think populism is I think a demagogic tendency. It's not confined to the right or the left. We have populists of both sides, but it's basically a politics of grievance. It's not a politics of principle. And we've always had on the conservative side a handful of people who say we're never going to beat them unless we adopt their tactics. If you listen to those people, all Democrats are 10 feet tall, and they're much smarter than we are, and they're much swifter than we are, and they're much better funded than we are. And the only way we can compete with them is by adopting the same kind of tactics they use. And what I'm disturbed about is that used to be a fringe idea, and it's now a much more mainstream idea. And President Trump was very direct about it. I mean, he made no apologies for feeling that way. I think most conservatives, principled conservatives, part of the reason they're not on the left is they don't want to be the left. So I don't want to adopt their tactics to beat them. And if you listen to some of the people who say otherwise, you would wonder how a Republican ever gets elected. And yet, we've had strings of Republican presidents. We've had Republicans in the majority in Congress. Right now, we're in even now when Republicans are in the minority, The Supreme Court has the strongest conservative majority that we've had in decades, and Congress is very, very tight. So I just don't buy the idea that we can't win arguments on principle, and that we have to stoop to demagoguery. I don't buy it, and it disturbs me that it seems like a lot of people are thinking along those lines, because if you're going to use the weaponry of the left, the reason it fits the left so well is they like government. They think government solutions and government as a weapon to achieve what their policy goals are. It all goes with the territory. That's where they're coming from. Whereas we are always, I think, when we're at our best, we're suspicious of government. We all want government to do the things we need it to do well. We're not anti-government, and we're not small government. I think where we need government to be big. We don't want a small military if we have if we have profound threats in the world. We want it to be big enough to do the things it has to do, but we want it to be limited government. We want it to stay within its lanes and not go outside. And we should be very suspicious of any. There may be a number of situations where it's appropriate to have some more government. The pandemic is probably a good example. There were certain things that needed to be done in the reaction to the pandemic that having government in the equation, even partnering with private businesses in order to get vaccines across the finish line and that sort of stuff, and to get material to places that needed it, that sort of thing we need government to be able to do. But I think we ought to be very suspicious about using government and government regulation as a way to crack back at our political adversaries, because that always bites us more in the end, and it doesn't fit us well. It's kind of the antithesis of who we are.
Yeah, I mean, every time I'm always trying to dissect what somebody means when they say they're a right-wing populist, and they usually one of their big issues is no more endless wars and things like that. So they become very isolationist. So I guess I don't know why that's populism, as opposed to just a policy stance, but they like to label themselves that way because it's quote unquote popular. So are $2,000 checks. I mean, you saw the right get really excited about $2,000 checks, and you're like, the problem with populism is it's emotional reasoning fundamentally, and so it's telling people what they want to hear and then calling it popular. Well, of course, free money is popular. That doesn't mean it's principled or based in any kind of good policy, and so you really have a lot of unintended consequences with that. And I think it's important for conservatives to keep speaking out against it. Stop pretending like this is a healthy part of the movement. It looks way more like liberals than conservatives. That's what it looks like to me. Because liberalism is an emotionally based governing philosophy, in my estimation. Yeah. And I don't think we should copy it. I got to go on that note, Andy. Got to go vote. I appreciate you being on.
Dan, my pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. Bye.